I've always believed in hard work, and that belief is what built my small business from the ground up. My name is Tony, and I own a car repair shop and a car wash on the outskirts of the city. For the past 15 years, it's been my pride and joy. Every scratch I polished out of a car's paintwork, every engine I tuned back to life, felt like I was building more than just a business. Felt like I was shaping my legacy. Owning this shop wasn't just a career for me, it was my life's work. My love for fixing cars came naturally, and I loved seeing the satisfaction on my customers' faces when they drove away with their vehicles running smoothly. Business was good, too. Steady income, loyal customers, and enough to keep our family well-fed and secure. My wife, Sandra, 10 years younger than me, was my world. I met her when she was just starting to figure out her future. I fell in love with her bright eyes, her ambition, and her endless optimism. When we got married, she hadn't finished her education, but I wanted to give her the life she deserved. I worked long days and nights to make sure Sandra could finish her studies without financial worries. I even funded additional courses for her, so she could have every opportunity to grow into the professional she wanted to become. Sandra blossomed. With her hard work and the support I provided, she got a degree in finance. Over the years, she found her footing in the corporate world, climbing the ladder from entry-level roles to becoming a respected financier. About a year ago, she landed a high-paying job at a prestigious investment fund, earning even a bit more than me now. Everything seemed perfect, or at least it should have been. We had 2 beautiful kids who meant the world to us, and a life built on years of effort and love. I was proud of her achievements and proud of the life we had built together. But looking back, I realized that was when things began to shift. Sandra's new job brought in the money, but it also brought something else. Sandra had become a stranger in our home. Her late nights at work turned into the norm. At first, I didn't think much of it. Her new job was demanding, and she'd always been ambitious. But as time went on, something felt off. Sandra started spending more time out of the house, claiming she had meetings or after-hours networking with colleagues. When she was home, she was distant, almost cold. The warmth in her voice and the playful banter we used to share were gone, replaced by curt responses and an invisible wall I couldn't break through. Then came the changes. The new clothes were the first thing I noticed, sleek designer outfits I'd never seen her wear before. And the perfume, an expensive scent that seemed to linger long after she'd left the room. Her phone was always buzzing, and she'd leave the room to answer it. I'd catch glimpses of her texting late at night, her face illuminated by the glow of her screen. It wasn't just her behavior that made me suspicious. It was the way she looked at me, if she looked at me at all. I felt like I wasn't her husband anymore, just a shadow occupying the same space. One evening, I decided enough was enough. When Sandra walked through the door, 2 hours later than she'd promised, I was waiting for her in the living room. "Sandra, we need to talk," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. She glanced at me, her expression a mix of annoyance and indifference. "Can it wait? I've had a long day." "No, it can't," I replied. "You've been staying late at work almost every night. You're always on your phone. You barely talk to me or the kids anymore. Something's wrong, and I need you to tell me what it is." Her lips pressed into a thin line as she set her bag down. "Tony, don't start with this. I'm busy. My job requires me to." "Don't give me that," I interrupted, the frustration bubbling over. "I've supported you every step of the way. I've worked my fingers to the bone to give you the life you have, and now you can't even look me in the eye. What's going on, Sandra?" For a moment I thought she might deny it, but instead she crossed her arms and said, "Fine. You want the truth? I'm seeing someone else." Her words hit me like a sledgehammer to the chest. "What? I'm having an affair, Tony, with Henry, my boss." Her tone was matter-of-fact, as if she were stating the weather. I felt like the floor had been ripped out from under me. How could you do this to me? To us? To our family?" Sandra's expression hardened. "Because, Tony, you don't get it. I'm not the same person I was when we got married. I've grown. I've moved forward. And you're stuck in the past." "Stuck in the past?" I echoed, incredulous. "Yes," she snapped. "Look at you. You're always covered in grease, wearing those filthy clothes from the shop. You look like a worker. Do you know how embarrassing it is to introduce you to people I work with? Henry is a presentable, confident man. He knows how to carry himself, how to influence people. He's everything you're not. Her words cut deep, each one a dagger in my heart. I stared at her, searching for the woman I had loved for so many years, but all I saw was someone who seemed almost proud of her betrayal. "You're ashamed of me?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Yes, Tony," she said bluntly. "I am. I can't keep pretending anymore. He's everything I've ever wanted. He's successful, respected. You wouldn't understand." I stood there silent as her words echoed in my mind. Finally I said, "You wouldn't even be working in that fancy office if it weren't for me. I paid for your education, for every opportunity you've had. I built this life for us, for you." Sandra scoffed, brushing off my words like they meant nothing. "And I'm supposed to spend the rest of my life grateful for that? Get over yourself, Tony. This is about more than money. It's about prestige, about being with someone who—" I cut her off, my voice firm. "Enough, Sandra. I won't tolerate this. I won't tolerate betrayal, and I won't tolerate your disrespect. If Henry is who you want, fine. But you'll face the consequences of your choice. We're done." She blinked, momentarily stunned. Then her face twisted in anger. "You think you can just throw me out like that?" "No," I said calmly. "But I can divorce you, and I will." Sandra's eyes flashed with fury. She cursed under her breath, grabbed her bag, and stormed out of the house. "I'm going out," she spat over her shoulder, her head held high. As the door slammed behind her, I stood there in the silence, the weight of her words pressing down on me. My world had just shattered, but one thing was clear. I wasn't going to let her walk all over me. Before you find out what happens next, please subscribe to the channel. The next morning, I headed to my auto repair shop, hoping the familiar rhythm of work would clear my mind. I had a couple of important repairs lined up and figured that keeping busy would help drown out the storm of thoughts swirling in my head about the divorce and finding a lawyer. By lunchtime, my assistants had taken off for their usual snack run, leaving me alone in the garage. It was just me, a stubborn bolt I was trying to loosen, and the occasional hum of traffic from the street. The garage felt like my sanctuary, until it wasn't. A sleek, shiny luxury car pulled up outside, the kind that looked like it would cry if it saw a speed bump. The door swung open, and out stepped a man in a tailored suit, the kind you only see in overpriced men's magazines or courtroom dramas. His expression was smug enough to power an entire block of streetlights. For a moment I thought he was a client. Maybe someone with more money than sense had decided to trust their fancy wheels to a humble mechanic like me. But then he strutted toward me, not walking, mind you, strutting, like a rooster who just discovered a mirror. "Are you Tony?" he asked, his tone suggesting that he was doing me a favor by existing in my garage. "Depends. Who's asking?" I replied, not bothering to look up from the car I was working on. "I'm Henry," he announced, puffing out his chest like a peacock mid-dance. "Sandra's boss. I came here to talk about her." Ah, so this was the Henry, the man responsible for wrecking my marriage and apparently my afternoon. My grip tightened on the wrench in my hand. It would have been so satisfying to introduce him to the business end of it, but I decided against it. After all, grease stains on his fancy suit would have been wasted on someone who probably thought a crescent wrench was a French pastry. Instead, I focused on tightening a stubborn bolt. "Talk fast. I've got work to do," I muttered. He took my silence as an invitation to launch into a monologue that would have put a motivational speaker to shame. "I'm here to protect Sandra from an ignoramus like you," he began, his voice dripping with condescension. "You should be grateful she's even giving you a divorce. I'm here to make sure it goes smoothly, on her terms, of course." I didn't dignify that with a response. Instead, I reached for another tool and went back to work. My indifference must have irritated him because he started pacing around the garage like he owned the place. "Listen," he continued, clearly unaware that I wasn't listening at all. "Sandra deserves better. You'll give her the house, waive any financial claims, and let her keep the kids, if you even care about them. You're not exactly a role model, are you? Covered in grease, stuck in this outdated shop. It's embarrassing, really. I gave him a glance, then reached over and handed him a greasy wrench. Buddy, hold this for a second. To my absolute delight, the idiot took it without thinking. The look on his face when he realized his pristine hands were now covered in oil was priceless. He froze, blinking at the wrench like it was some alien artifact. Couldn't help but chuckle. Thanks, I said, taking the wrench back. Henry stumbled over his words, clearly thrown off his script. But he recovered quickly, puffing up his chest again. You think this is funny? He barked. You won't be laughing when our lawyers come after you. We'll block your accounts, take your house, and make sure you lose everything. Sandra has the best legal team money can buy. I shrugged, keeping my tone casual. Yeah, and then what? His face turned red, but he pressed on. You'll be left with nothing, living in this garage like the grease monkey you are. Is that what you want? Huh. I wiped my hands on a rag, ignoring his rant, and walked over to grab another tool. He followed me like a lost puppy, still spouting off about morality, prestige, and laws he probably Googled 5 minutes before coming here. The best part? He kept trying to dominate the conversation, throwing around phrases like alpha male and real man. I nearly laughed out loud when he said, "You're just not in the same league as me, Tony." I looked at him, a smirk tugging at my lips. You're right, Henry. You and I? We're worlds apart. But if you ever need a real man to fix your fancy car, you know where to find me. Henry's face turned an interesting shade of red, his eyes bulging like a cartoon villain who just discovered his master plan had a fatal flaw. I'm not interested in talking to you here, he snapped, barely keeping his composure. But I'm doing this for Sandra. I'm holding back my communication for her sake, and I will see this through to the end. I offer you terms, and I hope you'll handle this in a cooperative way. Right? I replied, suppressing the urge to roll my eyes. Hang tight. I need to wash my hands. I headed to the adjacent stall where we kept the car wash equipment. To my mild horror, Henry followed me, still spouting threats about legal consequences, financial ruin, and how I'd regret underestimating him. I nodded absent-mindedly, letting his words flow over me like the background noise of a TV I'd forgotten to turn off. As I reached for the tap to rinse the oil off my hands, I noticed that Henry had planted himself directly in front of the hose. The image was too good to pass up. Without a second thought, I turned the wrong tap. A powerful stream of cold water shot out of the hose like a fire hydrant on the 4th of July. The blast hit Henry square in the chest, soaking his designer suit in a split second. He flailed like a cat that had just been shoved into a bathtub, barely managing to stay upright. Damn it! I shouted, playing the part of the shocked mechanic. Who messed with the water pressure adjustment again? Henry sputtered, water streaming down his face, his hair plastered to his forehead. He looked like a drowned rooster that had just lost a particularly humiliating fight. Oh man, I said, suppressing a grin as I turned off the tap. That's awkward. Sorry about that. Although, on the other hand, you were looking a bit overheated. Consider it a fresh start. Karma's funny like that. Henry stood frozen, dripping wet, his mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air. For a moment I thought he'd been struck mute, but then he found his voice. What are you doing? Do you know how much this suit costs? He bellowed. You'll pay for this, Tony. Mark my words. I will punish you. The sheer drama of it was too much. Just as he turned on his heel to storm out, his fancy Italian loafers betrayed him. With a sound like a wet sponge being slapped onto tile, he slipped on a puddle and landed flat on his back. Couldn't help it. I burst out laughing. Oh no, I said between gasps for air. Not the mighty alpha male taken down by a puddle. Somebody call the press. At that moment Dave, one of my assistants, walked into the stall, his expression somewhere between confused and horrified. Boss? What's going on here? Dave, I said, still laughing. Meet Henry. He's here on important business. Dave, ever the good Samaritan, rushed to help Henry, who was lying on the floor groaning like a deflated balloon. He grabbed Henry by the arm to lift him up, but as he pulled, I heard the unmistakable sound of fabric tearing. The sleeve of Henry's very expensive jacket gave way like it had just surrendered in battle. Henry's face twisted into a mask of anguish. My jacket! This jacket cost more than your month's salary, you morons. Well, I said, unable to resist. That's what happens when you mix dry clean only with a Tony Special Power Washington. Dave finally managed to get Henry upright, though his dignity was beyond salvage. I saw that his face was contorted, and he was almost crying. It was funny. A few minutes ago he was the alpha male, and now he was a little crying boy who had fallen in a puddle and needed his mommy to take pity on him. Soaked, sniffling and looking like a scolded toddler, Henry limped toward his car. His wet shoes made a pitiful squeaking sound with every step. You might want to reconsider those terms, I called after him, grinning from ear to ear. Henry didn't reply. He slid into his luxury car, dripping water onto the leather seats, and drove off. Dave turned to me, shaking his head. Boss, what was that? That, I said, still chuckling, was karma giving us a front row seat to poetic justice. And with that, I went back to the stubborn bolt on the car, feeling like I just won the best comedy show of the year, for free. After the spectacle in the garage, Dave was practically bouncing with excitement. Boss, we gotta see this on the cameras. That was legendary. I wasn't going to stop him. In fact, I was curious myself. We headed to the office, where the surveillance system recorded everything that happened in the workshop, including the audio. As soon as we replayed the clip, we were doubled over laughing. Seeing Henry, soaked and slipping like a newborn deer, was even funnier on camera. The sound of his pompous threats only made it better. Dave burned the video onto a flash drive for me. You should keep this forever, he said, grinning ear to ear. Oh, I plan to, I replied. And I know just where to start using it. Armed with my new evidence, I found a lawyer that afternoon and headed straight to his office. His name was Mr. Collins, a sharp, no-nonsense type who looked like he ate contracts for breakfast and lawsuits for dessert. I laid everything out for him. Sandra's affair, Henry's ridiculous behavior, and, of course, the video. When I played the recording for him, Mr. Collins leaned back in his chair, a slow smile spreading across his face. This, he said, pointing at the screen, is gold. His threats are all there. This'll help us ensure Sandra doesn't get a dime more than she's entitled to, which, frankly, won't be much. That's the plan, I said, feeling a little lighter for the first time in days. Collins assured me that we'd handle the divorce on my terms. He started drafting the paperwork while I headed back home. The house was eerily quiet, which wasn't surprising. Sandra was probably out with her alpha cock, Henry, as I'd started referring to him in my head. The kids were on a hiking trip with my sister, and I was glad they weren't around to see this mess. It was the perfect time to get some adult-level housekeeping done. First on the list, protect my assets. I changed all the locks on the house, making sure Sandra wouldn't be able to waltz back in as if nothing had happened. Then I called the bank and froze our joint accounts. No way was I going to let her or Henry get their hands on my hard-earned money. With that done, I moved on to the next task, packing Sandra's belongings. It was surprisingly therapeutic. Her fancy clothes, expensive perfumes, and even those designer heels she never wore. All of it went into boxes. I set the boxes neatly by the entrance, making sure they were ready for pickup. I had just finished when I heard the unmistakable sound of Sandra's car pulling up. I stepped back into the living room and waited, arms crossed. A moment later, I heard a string of colorful language coming from outside. What the hell? She shrieked. Why won't this door open? I stayed put, smirking as she tried and failed to use her key. Eventually, my phone rang. Tony, what's going on? The door won't open, she snapped, her voice dripping with irritation. I answered calmly, go to your alpha wet peacock. I mean, boss, you two are driving me crazy. There was a moment of stunned silence on the other end before she exploded. You can't do this, Tony. You'll regret this. Let me in right now. Sorry, Sandra, I said, my tone even. You made your choice and now I'm making mine. Your stuff's outside. Have a nice life. I hung up before she could say another word. From the window, I watched as she stomped to the boxes, muttering angrily to herself. She loaded them into her car with all the grace of a toddler throwing a tantrum, glaring at the house every few seconds. Before driving off, she shouted something about how I'd regret this and how I'd pay for it all in the end. The trial was set to take place 2 weeks later, and by the time the court date rolled around, Sandra and Henry had clearly convinced themselves that they had the upper hand. Sandra showed up wearing an outfit that probably cost more than my monthly expenses, her chin high, her eyes shooting daggers at me. And Henry? He was in another one of his suits, strutting like a peacock who thought he was the star of the show. The courtroom wasn't packed, but there were enough people there to witness what would become a performance for the ages. My lawyer, Mr. Collins, was calm and collected, while Sandra had dragged along a small army of high-priced lawyers. Henry sat in the front row, arms crossed, occasionally whispering into Sandra's ear, as if he had some profound legal insight to offer. The fireworks began almost immediately. Sandra's lawyer kicked off with the expected sob story about how I was a negligent, unpresentable husband who had failed her. They painted Sandra as the hard-working, sophisticated woman who had outgrown her simple mechanic of a husband. Then Henry took the stand. He started by portraying himself as the gallant protector of Sandra, claiming he had stepped in to defend her from my unhinged and violent behavior. According to him, I had viciously attacked him, ruined his suit, and humiliated him publicly. I stayed quiet, letting Mr. Collins work his magic. When it was our turn, Collins rose from his seat with the kind of confidence that made it clear he'd been waiting for this moment. Your Honor, he began, my client has a piece of evidence that will shed some light on Mr. Henry's claims. With a nod, Collins played the video from my workshop. The courtroom filled with the sound of Henry's pompous threats, his attempts to dominate the conversation, and, of course, the unforgettable moment when he got blasted by the hose. Henry's face turned beet red as the video played, and when the clip reached the part where he slipped in the puddle, there was audible snickering from the spectators. Even the judge had to hide a smirk behind her hand. My client, Collins said, pausing the video on a frame where Henry was sprawled on the floor, was not the aggressor in this situation. As you can see, Mr. Henry's claims of being attacked are greatly exaggerated. Henry sputtered that that's out of context. Out of context? Collins echoed, raising an eyebrow. Would you care to explain what context would justify threatening someone in their place of work and then filing a false claim of assault? Henry's team of lawyers looked like they wanted to crawl under the table. One by one, Collins dismantled their arguments, pointing out inconsistencies and presenting evidence that left them scrambling. The second day of the trial focused on the division of assets, custody, and finances. Sandra had expected to walk away with the house, full custody of the kids, and a hefty chunk of my income. But Mr. Collins wasn't about to let that happen. We have evidence, Collins said, presenting bank statements, that Mrs. Sandra used joint funds to support her affair, including expensive things and trips with Mr. Henry. This is a clear misuse of marital assets. Sandra's lawyer tried to deflect, but Collins cut him off with more evidence. He provided old bills and statements of how I supported Sandra's by paying for her education and additional programs. All of the financial and emotional support I gave Sandra, all of which my attorney used as additional arguments, and now that she was making good money, she didn't need me anymore. The custody battle was next. Sandra's team argued that I wasn't fit to be the primary caregiver. Collins, however, presented testimony from my sister, who spoke about my hands-on parenting, and even letters from the kids' teachers praising my involvement in their lives. Mr. Tony, Collins said in his closing argument, has demonstrated time and again that he is a devoted father and a hard worker. Mrs. Sandra, on the other hand, has prioritized her affair over her responsibilities as a parent. By the end of the first hearing, Sandra's case was crumbling, but the icing on the cake came shortly after. Henry disappeared. Apparently, he'd realized that being tied to Sandra wasn't worth the trouble. He not only distanced himself from the case, but also contributed to Sandra's dismissal from her job at the investment fund. Rumor had it that Henry had put pressure on the company to cut ties with her, fearing that her presence would draw further attention to his blunders. At the second hearing, Sandra was visibly shaken. With Henry gone, her lawyers floundering, and her finances in tatters, she was a shadow of the woman who had confidently walked into the courtroom on day one. The judge ruled in my favor on nearly every point. I kept the house, full custody of the kids, and the majority of our assets. Sandra was left with her personal belongings and a stern warning from the judge about her conduct. As I walked out of the courthouse, I felt an overwhelming sense of relief. Sandra had tried to humiliate me and Henry had tried to intimidate me, but in the end, neither of them had the backbone to see it through. It wasn't just a legal victory. It was a reminder that no matter how much someone tries to knock you down, integrity and perseverance win every time. Life after the divorce wasn't easy, not by a long shot. My focus was on the kids, helping them process what had happened, and adjusting to life without their mother around all the time. They were old enough to understand betrayal and they were angry. They didn't want to see Sandra, not after how everything went down. I did my best to shield them from the ugliness of it all. But there were still tough days, questions I didn't have answers to, and moments when their hurt mirrored my own. But we managed. Day by day, I rebuilt a sense of normalcy. My machine shop kept me busy. The kids kept me grounded. And slowly, the heaviness of what Sandra had done began to lift. Sandra, on the other hand, didn't fare as well. Losing Henry and her job in quick succession left her scrambling. The woman who had once looked down on me for being a worker was now learning how hard life could be when you didn't have someone holding you up. She reached out a few times, asking for an honest and open conversation. I knew what she was after. She wanted me to be the safety net she'd burned to the ground. I wasn't interested. When she betrayed me, it wasn't just the affair. It was the way she tried to tear me down, humiliate me, and act as if everything I'd done for her meant nothing. There was no coming back from that. She made her choices, and now she had to deal with the fallout. As for Henry, the so-called alpha male, his downfall came sooner than I expected. It turned out that while he was great at strutting around and barking orders, he was an absolute disaster at actually doing his job. Once the chaos of our trial was over, the higher-ups at his firm started digging into his work and uncovered a mess of botched projects and poor leadership. He was fired within months, and from what I heard through the grapevine, his reputation in the industry was so tarnished that no one wanted to touch him. Sometimes karma works faster than you'd think. If you enjoyed the story, please subscribe to the channel. I wish you a great mood and good luck.